Shin Sung-yoon, 55 years old, struggled to catch his breath as he rested inside the cave. The weight of exhaustion pressed heavily on him. In that moment, he couldn't help but question his decision to keep going at his age. While others were winding down and preparing for retirement, it gnawed at him. His life seemed to be nothing but one big failure. A low growl pulled him back into the present. A monstrous figure loomed at the edge of the cage where he had been resting. With a muttered curse, he lamented that they wouldn't even let him rest for a moment. As the beasts lunged at him, he pushed himself to his feet, drawing his sword. His thoughts turned to the players of his time, those hailed as sword saints, legends in their own right. While he, an aging swordsman, was ridiculed for his age, ignored by most. Wasn't that enough reason to doubt everything? Shin had never known a family. Raised in an orphanage, he had witnessed a horrifying scene. A monster gripping his teacher, crushing her skull while she screamed for him to run. But he couldn't move. The orphanage, his makeshift family, had been destroyed during the collapse. The day the skies split open and monsters rained down, taking everything he had left. Yet, despite the devastation, he had not given up. Just when he thought death had come for him, a mysterious figure appeared, saving his life. The man had asked if he was all right, but all Shin could do was cry silently, overwhelmed by the miraculous rescue. Years had passed since then, and now Shin's sword sliced through the neck of another monster. He fought for that figure, driven by the desire to be like him. But despite all his efforts, he never grew stronger and never protected anything. When the last of the monsters fell, Shin plunged his sword into the ground, his body trembling, his energy drained. He was aging, and his body was finally reaching its limit. Then, a new growl, deeper and more menacing, echoed from behind him. Confused, Shin looked up to find a monstrous titan before him, its jaws opening wide, preparing to unleash a blast of fire. As the heat washed over him, he exhaled slowly, his thoughts spiraling. No home, no family, no dreams. His life had been a string of failures, regrets that weighed heavily on his chest. His eyes filled with tears as he realized how deeply he had messed up. He longed for a chance to go back. Moments later, Shin Sung-yoon stood victorious over the dungeon's boss. The system's voice congratulated him for clearing the ancient dragon's nest, but instead of feeling a sense of accomplishment, frustration welled up inside him. At nearly 60 years old, he was still pushing his body to the limit. 30 years as a swordsman, and his greatest achievement was ranking in the country's top 100, a meager accomplishment in a world overflowing with players. To him, it felt like being a single needle lost in an infinite haystack. A book materialized before him, and he wondered if it was a skill book. Considering his past, he even wondered if it was something edible. He had eaten artifacts before, but before he could examine it further, the dungeon entrance opened, and a message from the system caught his attention. Constellation, late bloomer, model student has entered. Late bloomer, as he casually called him, spoke directly to him, congratulating him for his hard work and praising his impeccable final strike. It was a dramatic entrance, but Shin couldn't deny the appreciation he felt. After all, it was Late Bloomer who had contracted with him back when he was just a third-rate swordsman. Late Bloomer reminded him of an important milestone. Reaching level 850 would double all artifact and title stats, and at level 900, they would triple. Shin stared at him, speechless. He was currently level 650. The conditions were so unreasonable, and despite having a powerful constellation, he hadn't reaped any benefits from their contract. Late Bloomer urged him to consume the skill book. Shin, unimpressed, replied that he had planned on doing so anyway, activating his unique ability, Devour Artifacts. For years, Shin had tried to understand his power. He had boiled, fried, and experimented with artifacts, only to find nothing changed. It wasn't until he realized that mana synchronization with a compatible artifact was the key to unlocking his skill that he understood what he had been doing wrong. 30 years had passed by the time he figured it out. Others had grown stronger the moment they awakened, while he had wasted so much precious time. But now, the book remained unchanged. Annoyed, he tossed it aside, wondering if it even counted as a skill book. Late Bloomer, just as surprised, apologized, explaining that the information on Devour Artifacts was extremely limited. He suggested that Shin try again with mana synchronization, assuring him that there was still plenty of time. Shin scoffed. Time? He was nearly 60 years old. If he had a child at 30, they would be 30 by now. He could even have grandchildren. Late Bloomer, being a constellation, didn't understand. Humans didn't have the luxury of time. Late Bloomer fell silent, then quietly apologized again. Shin sighed, telling him it wasn't his fault. His life had just been full of regrets. Late Bloomer seemed taken aback by his words, but Shin continued. He had spent so many years chasing after someone whose back he could never catch. He had given his all, but now he was simply too tired, too old. Late Bloomer was quiet, then smiled gently, but Shin, resolute, told him to note this. He was retiring. Their contract was over. Late Bloomer should find another player. As Shin spoke, strange purple smoke began swirling around him. Before he could react, Late Bloomer cast a spell, and the smoke thickened. thickened. The last thing Shin saw was a system message: Constellation Late Bloomer, model student has initiated an experimental essence regression process. Outside the dungeon, player G and reporter Park Youngmin observed the unusual phenomenon. Youngmin asked if this was the typical environment players worked in. Han Hunjiang, CEO of Hunjiang Corporation, confirmed the assumption, explaining that dungeons were just stepping stones for players, while gates connected to unknown dimensions were the uncharted territories they aimed to conquer. Back in Shin's apartment, he absent-mindedly cleaned his dagger while watching a broadcast where Hunjiang explained the nature of dungeons. The familiarity of the program sent a chill down his spine. It had been years since he last saw the show, and now he realized the truth. He had truly regressed. 4 days had passed since his return. He was back 30 years, his body, no longer the weathered form of a 55-year-old warrior, but his 25-year-old self. Every memory of his previous life was intact. The only explanation could be Late Bloomer, an incredible miracle granted by the constellation. Shin absent-mindedly rolled his dagger in his hand before catching it, still bewildered. Deciding not to dwell on it, he considered going out to work. The system displayed information on his weapon: Venomoth's dagger, a bronze artifact with 17 attack power and an additional +10 agility effect. He recognized it as a lucky find for his current age. Though its rank was low, he knew its hidden skill was valuable. The system showed that his absorption rate was 10%. After using it before, it had increased to 20%. Though the rate was still low due to the lack of extended use, what mattered most was the dagger's hidden skill. Without hesitation, Shin activated mana synchronization, entering the unconscious gap, a necessary passage to absorb the artifact. His hair turned a shining white. He was always nervous about stepping into the gap, unsure of what the artifact would turn into. This time, the dagger transformed into a perfectly cooked fried chicken. The system confirmed that the preparation for absorption was complete, and the dish evolved into a rotisserie chicken, drizzled with olive oil. Relieved, Shin eagerly dug in, commenting that he wouldn't mind eating such a dish again. After consuming the artifact, he permanently gained +2 agility and acquired the hidden skill Demon Bash. As the dagger disappeared, he felt a pang of regret, but was ultimately satisfied with the new skill. Ready to move forward, he set out to continue his journey. Meanwhile, at Dungeon 85, managed by Team Yoon Daekyung, a panicked man rushed to Yoon Daekyung, the leader of the Porter Group. Daekyung asked him what the issue was. The man explained that one of his team members, a newcomer who had joined just 4 days ago, Shin Sang-yun, had unexpectedly pulled out. Unconcerned, Daekyung dismissed the problem, informing the man that Shin had been assigned to the player team, not the Porter team. The Porter leader was shocked, arguing that Shin was an untrained newcomer who hadn't even finished the player academy. He demanded to know how he was supposed to redistribute the work, but Daekyung merely sighed, reminding him that he was responsible for the team's adjustments. The Porter leader awkwardly laughed and walked away, though his unease lingered. Daekyung's vice guild leader, skeptical of the decision, questioned it. Daekyung, however, had his reasons. If someone had to fail, it would be Shin. Letting him fail would remind the Porters of their place and reinforce the importance of the players. He scoffed at the idea of a level 1 player contributing anything. However, neither of them knew that Shin had overheard their conversation. Calmly, he stepped forward and greeted them, announcing that from now on, he would be working as a player. The Porters glared at him, while the players sneered, amused by his sudden declaration. It was clear they underestimated him. Daekyung, barely suppressing amusement, acknowledged him, noting his weapon of choice, a longsword. The absurdity of someone believing they could master such a weapon through self-study was laughable. He humored the idea, declaring that what mattered most in battle was spirit. With that, he rallied the team, signaling the start of the dungeon raid. One by one, the players stepped through the portal, Shin following closely behind. As Daekyung stood to the side, watching, a freshly awakened player attempting to challenge a dungeon with mere YouTube knowledge, it was reckless. The dungeon was a notorious orc lair, a death trap for the inexperienced. Failure was inevitable, but moments later, the dungeon floor was littered with the bodies of orcs. The sight left Daekyung dumbfounded. His mind raced, struggling to process the carnage before him. Scanning the battlefield, the question gnawed at him. Who was Shin Sang-yun, and what had he just witnessed? Orcs were a staple of fantasy worlds, appearing frequently in games, novels, and films. Due to their common presence, many players tended to underestimate them, considering them weak compared to legendary creatures like dragons. While orcs lacked intelligence and relied heavily on brute strength, their sheer physical power made them formidable foes. As a result, overconfident newcomers often rushed into battle against them without proper caution, only to meet an untimely end. Orcs possessed an undeniable physical superiority over humans. Their overwhelming might had earned them the ominous title, the Wall of Lament. As the party ventured deeper into the dungeon, reminders were given to Sang-hyun that no special treatment would be provided. As a newcomer, he was expected to fend for himself. The leader of the Porter team displayed open disdain, ridiculing Sang-hyun's apparent arrogance for acting experienced experience so soon after awakening. Sang-hyun, however, merely responded with an awkward chuckle and a promise to do his best. The porter leader remained unimpressed, making it clear that effort alone would not be enough. Proof of ability was required. Despite the hostility, Sang-hyun maintained his composure and requested to fight on the front line should they encounter a monster. The request initially stunned the leader into silence, resulting in laughter and disbelief at such an audacious demand. Before further objections could be made, a sharp cry pierced the air. An orc had appeared behind them. Sang-hyun tightened his grip on his sword, preparing for his first real battle since regressing. Before he could advance, another player surged ahead, shield raised, colliding with the orc and forcing it back. Frustration arose over Sang-hyun's perceived recklessness, as concerns were raised about his sluggish movements and the impracticality of wielding a great sword effectively. Yet Sang-hyun remained unfazed, offering calm assurances that assistance would not be necessary. Annoyance grew, prompting demands for him to prove his claim, oblivious to the looming danger as the orc raised its weapon. Warnings were issued, yet irritation led to disregard, leaving the player vulnerable. As the massive axe descended, terror froze the man in place, realization dawning too late. At the last moment, Daekyung intervened, his shield slamming into the orc, knocking it off balance. Frustration over the careless blunder led to harsh reprimands, questioning whether the group had entered the dungeon for a mere excursion. Apologies followed as silence settled over the team. Regaining control of the situation, Daekyung took command, ordering the others to stand back while he handled the orc. Enraged by the interference, the creature lunged forward once more. The axe cleaved through the air in a powerful arc, yet Daekyung braced against the strike before driving his sword into its chest. Cheers erupted from the team, believing the fight to be concluded. However, the orc's eyes flared open with renewed fury. A deafening roar accompanied its retaliation, wrenching the embedded sword free and counterattacking with even greater ferocity. The impact shattered the ground, narrowly missing Daekyung as he leaped back just in time. Frustration grew as the realization settled. His initial strike had not been enough. Irritation prompted another attack, the sword plunging into the same wound with renewed force. As the blade was pulled free, the creature finally collapsed. Relief spread through the team as admiration for Daekyung's strength surfaced. Dismissing the praise with laughter, he ensured the group's readiness before signaling them to advance. Before movement could resume, guttural growls reverberated through the dungeon. The ground trembled beneath an approaching wave of orcs, warriors, high orcs, and heavily armored adversaries. Panic rippled through the team as attention turned to Daekyung for guidance. Though his exterior remained composed, unease settled within. If a single orc had proven so challenging, how could the horde be managed? Before strategy could be formulated, Sang-hyun unexpectedly stepped forward, expressing his intent to face them alone. Silence fell as disbelief spread through the group. Outrage followed, accusations of recklessness and insanity directed at him. Daekyung, attempting reason, acknowledged the excitement of awakening but emphasized the peril of such an action. Yet before further objections could be voiced, Sang-hyun had already moved. Alarm surged through Daekyung as he called out warnings, foreseeing disaster. However, Sang-hyun closed in on the nearest orc, swinging his greatsword in a decisive motion, cleaving the massive creature cleanly in half. The battlefield stood frozen. Disbelief filled the air as murmurs of astonishment surfaced. The effortless nature of the strike contradicted all expectations. Unconcerned, Sang-hyun rested his sword on his shoulder, evaluating the smoothness of the cut, considering the possibility that his performance was hindered by his current level. A system window materialized, confirming his unremarkable statistics. Level 1, no title, no constellation, a single skill, devour artifact, health at 200, mana at 20, experience at 40. Yet despite these unimpressive numbers, he had just eliminated a monster that had nearly overwhelmed the strongest member of their party. The remaining orcs, enraged by the loss of their comrade, launched a coordinated assault. Sang-hyun, undeterred, calmly acknowledged his low level but emphasized his extensive experience. Swift, precise movements followed as he systematically cut them down, their bodies falling apart with each stroke. The armored orc, their leader, retaliated with crushing force. Sang-hyun narrowly dodged, countering with a strike that should have bisected the creature, only to find that his blade barely left a scratch. Daekyung recognized the issue immediately. The orc's skin was too tough for conventional weapons. The orc counterattacked with lethal speed, the axe descending toward Sang-hyun's neck, only to halt mere inches away. Daekyung braced for the worst, yet Sang-hyun remained unfazed, reassuring that concern was unnecessary. The orc struggled, immobilized, ensnared by the effects of the demon bash skill, rendering it motionless for 2 crucial seconds. Seizing the opportunity, Sang-hyun delivered a clean clean, decisive strike, severing the orc's head. Silence followed as the battlefield remained stunned. Daekyung, struggling to process the scene, questioned Sang-hyun's abilities. The timing of his awakening did not align with such a level of skill. Examination of his weapon yielded further confusion. An ordinary artifact, the fated greatsword, devoid of enhancements. The realization settled in. Sang-hyun's strength was entirely his own. Before deeper contemplation could occur, an urgent warning cut through the tension. The middle boss approached. The presence of a yellow-haired man signaled rising concern, but the group prepared to advance regardless. Sang-hyun, however, had a single request. If he defeated the demon orc alone, he would claim the artifact reward. The Crimson Stone, an artifact that could only be obtained by defeating demon orcs, was infamous for its incredibly low drop rate. Even after slaying hundreds of them in his past life, Sang-hyun had never acquired it. Instead, he had once witnessed another party obtaining the stone after his own team had failed to defeat the demon orc. He still remembered the moment vividly, the victorious party celebrating, congratulating their captain, and eagerly discussing its value. They had speculated whether it would fetch a high price on the market and if it truly possessed the legendary delay skill. Now, standing in the present, he knew that skill was exactly what he needed. Daekyung had ignored his earlier question, prompting Sang-hyun to press him again. Knowing their party distributed loot based on contribution, if he defeated the monster alone, there should be no issue. Yet Daekyung remained silent. The reaction was concerning, but Sang-hyun had no time to dwell on it. Most players dismissed overconfident rookies, none would take him seriously. As expected, hostility erupted. The other players scoffed, questioning his sanity, accusing him of arrogance, and dismissing his ability just because he had killed a few orcs. Despite their anger, he remained steadfast, urging them to calm down. Then, unexpectedly, Daekyung declared that Sang-hyun could do as he pleased, on one condition. If their party failed to defeat the boss, he would be allowed to enter the dungeon alone and claim the kill himself. The other players turned to their leader in disbelief, stunned by the proposition. A moment later, Daekyung locked eyes with Sang-hyun, his expression unreadable, and made sure he understood the terms. Seeing things proceed smoother than anticipated, Sang-hyun nodded in agreement. Daekyung turned away, silently fuming. Sang-hyun's arrogance was insufferable, acting as if one broken skill made him untouchable. Fueled by frustration, he swore to clear the dungeon himself and silence the upstart once and for all. With a firm grip on the door handle leading to the middle boss's chamber, Daekyung vowed to prove that experience was what truly mattered. He pushed open the heavy door and stepped inside, fully prepared to showcase his strength. But the moment his eyes landed on the bloodthirsty demon orc waiting within, confidence wavered. The massive creature stood, bound by heavy chains that clinked ominously as it glared at them. Wasting no time, Daekyung ordered his team into formation. Despite its intimidating presence, his information suggested it was an easy opponent. He instructed them to encircle the monster and attack from the rear, smirking as he imagined proving Sang-hyun wrong. Without hesitation, Daekyung lunged forward, leading the charge. Mere moments later, he lay sprawled on the ground, bleeding. Dazed, he struggled to comprehend what had just happened. His mind raced, searching for an answer. From the sidelines, Sang-hyun sighed, watching them falter. It was exactly the same as before. This was why they had failed in his past life. Panic spread among the team. A frantic voice demanded a plan. Another accused the orcs of being far stronger than expected. Realization dawned too late. Daekyung had relied too much on second-hand information. Gritting his teeth, he ordered a retreat, knowing the demon orc's poor peripheral vision would allow them to escape if they slipped past its flank. The players did not hesitate. Before leaving, Daekyung cast one last glance at Sang-hyun, a final warning lingering in his gaze. If Sang-hyun died, he would not be blamed. Sang-hyun, unfazed, stepped forward. He had no intention of dying today. As the demon orc charged, he met it head-on. Comparing stats directly, he had no chance, but experience told him otherwise. When the monster's massive axe came crashing down, he deflected it with his sword, sparks flying upon impact. From a distance, the fleeing players hesitated, disbelief creeping into their expressions. Had he really just deflected that? Sang-hyun flexed his hand, shaking off the sting. Deflecting was all he could manage for now. His gaze locked onto the crimson stone embedded deep in the monster's chest. It had been a long time since he had last seen it. The reason he coveted the crimson stone was simple: its special effect. Delay, when combined with his own Demon Bash, had the potential to create an infinite stun loop. Demon Bash's 2-second stun was already powerful, but merging it with delay through his Devour artifact skill would change everything. Now, he just needed to claim it. The demon orc roared, swinging again. Sang-hyun taunted it, provoking another attack. The more predictable its patterns, the easier it became to exploit its weaknesses. Timing his movement perfectly, he sidestepped and slashed into its side. The monster's grip on its weapon loosened as Demon Bash took effect, stunning it for 2 seconds. From a distance, Daekyung stared, his breath catching. Was that skill effective against middle bosses? It was broken. Sang-hyun, unimpressed, observed the creature's response. Orcs were simple-minded. He had expected better from a demon orc. But the monster suddenly broke free of the stun, lashing out with a powerful kick. The impact sent Sang-hyun flying, but he managed to stabilize himself by stabbing his sword into the ground. He had underestimated the Demon Orc's self-regeneration ability, which lifted stun effect. With Demon Bash requiring a 15-second cooldown, the only option left was to defeat the monster outright. The Demon Orc charged once more, but this time, Sang-hyun stood his ground. He deflected the attack downward, using the monster's strength against it. Watching from afar, the remaining players grew restless. One urged retreat, convinced even the stun wouldn't save him. But Daekyung remained silent, lost in thought. There was a massive gap between their stats. So how was Sang-hyun still standing? Was he really just a rookie? Analyzing the fight with calculated precision, Sang-hyun saw his opening. Timing his strike perfectly, he thrust his sword forward, piercing the Demon Orc's chest and shattering its axe in one decisive blow. A system message appeared. Crimson Stone. Artifact rank. Silver special effect. Delay increases health and strength by 10. The Crimson Stone hovered before him, a crystallization of strength, tenacity, and endurance. As mana synchronization activated, unconsciousness overtook him, and his hair shifted into a radiant white. For a moment, he stood motionless. Before his eyes, the Crimson Stone transformed, morphing into a steaming bowl of Master Chef's Biam Nun, complete with meat jelly. A grin spread across his face. Resisting such a classic combination was impossible. Lifting a perfect bite with his chopsticks, noodles and pork together, he ate wholeheartedly. As the meal disappeared, a system notification appeared, confirming the absorption of the Crimson Stone. The notification detailed an absorption rate of 20%, granting an increase of 2 points in both strength and health. Minutes later, the bowl was empty, and with it, the special effect Delay had been acquired. Another notification followed, allowing Delay to be bound to an existing skill. A nervous excitement settled in. Without hesitation, Delay was bound to Demon Bash. The system processed the enhancement instantly, revising the skill's effects. Repeated use would now extend the stun duration, ensuring a second stun, a 90% success rate for a third, a 60% chance for a fourth, and a 30% likelihood for any further consecutive uses. Emerging from unconsciousness, realization struck. The earlier speculation of a 4-second stun loop had now become reality. Before further contemplation could take place, Daekyung appeared, signaling the need for discussion. A glance toward the looming final boss room, the Orc Berserker, made the subject of the conversation obvious. Acknowledging the situation, Sang-hyun questioned his necessity in the upcoming battle. Daekyung dismissed any thoughts of exclusion, emphasizing that ignoring a teammate of his caliber would be a mistake. With an extended hand, the agreement was solidified. Sang-hyun accepted, reminding Daekyung of his condition. Without hesitation, they were agreed upon. As preparations concluded, a yellow-haired player called out, signaling the party's readiness. Daekyung acknowledged the cue, instructing everyone to remain on guard. A sharp glare caught Sang-hyun's attention. Turning back, his gaze met the piercing eyes of the yellow-haired player, his expression unreadable. A fleeting moment of surprise and confusion passed before attention shifted back to the mission at hand. The final boss room loomed ahead. As they stepped inside, a low growl resonated through the chamber. The Orc Berserker, massive and seething with rage, slowly rose to its feet. The party took their positions. Daekyung moved to take the lead, but before he could act, Sang-hyun advanced first, gripping his longsword. Without turning back, he instructed Daekyung to follow his lead. Initial objections surfaced, but were disregarded. Sang-hyun remained resolute. Understanding that the Berserker's skill resistance was lower than the Demon Orcs, he knew that maintaining composure and precision would ensure victory. With explosive speed, he dashed forward. The Orc Berserker roared, its weapons, a mace, club, and flail, swinging wildly in a frenzied charge. As Sang-hyun sprinted toward the beast, a fleeting thought crossed his mind. Confidence had never come naturally. His younger self had been plagued with fear, his older self with struggle, but now, hesitation had no place. The Berserker's weapon came crashing down. With a single movement, Sang-hyun deflected the strike with his sword. His mind was clear. This was his moment, to change his past, to shape his future. The Orc Berserker lunged once more, yet this time, Sang-hyun did not waver. With one clean swing, the Berserker's arm was severed. A monstrous scream echoed through the chamber. From the sidelines, Daekyung stood frozen in shock, stunned by the overwhelming display of strength. Quickly regaining composure, he seized the opportunity. Directing the party, he ordered an all-out assault during the 4-second stun window. Without hesitation, the players charged, unleashing relentless attacks. Minutes later, the system notification confirmed their victory. The Orc Berserker had fallen, and the dungeon was cleared. Expressions of disbelief spread among the players. The battle had seemed almost effortless. Meanwhile, nearby porters engaged in hushed discussions. Some debated the possibility of becoming Sang-hyun's personal porter, while others prepared to approach him with offers offers. The shift in attitude was almost comical. As Sang-hyun processed the victory, a system notification alerted him to a level up and the acquisition of a new title, D rank, with overwhelming power. The title extended the duration of status effects by 10%. Titles were rare. In his previous life, he had never obtained one. The realization of his 4.4-second stun's potency only fueled his ambition. A comparison to Do Gyung-soo, the Ghostblade, the strongest swordsman in Korea, entered his thoughts. 2 years after the Age of Players had begun, Gyung-soo had surpassed level 500. Before Sang-hyun's regression, admiration had been the only possibility. Now, catching up was no longer out of reach. Daekyung observed the shift in Sang-hyun's demeanor, questioning his thoughts. Caught off guard, Sang-hyun awkwardly stretched in response. Amused, Daekyung handed him an artifact, acknowledging his contribution. Insisting it was merely a bronze rank artifact, Daekyung's gesture carried weight. Sang-hyun, suspicious of the generosity, pointed it out. Daekyung admitted that true generosity had its limits, yet in reality, their paths had already diverged. Sang-hyun was stepping into a world beyond theirs. From the shadows, the yellow-haired player seethed with frustration. Daekyung's favor had always belonged to him, so why was Sang-hyun the one receiving attention? Anger twisted into resentment as a phone was retrieved and a call was placed. Shin Sang-hyun's apartment, Songpa District, Jamsil-dong. A triumphant shout echoed through the small apartment. Sang-hyun reveled in success. The sheer thrill of victory reaffirmed why he had chosen this path. Checking his bank account, a pleasant surprise awaited. 6 million won. Far exceeding typical earnings, the sum was a direct result of Daekyung's appreciation. Among the rewards, the Berserker Ring stood out, a bronze rank artifact that granted 10 additional points in strength and the ability Lighten, which reduced the weight of equipped artifacts to a single gram at the cost of mana. Most players struggled with mana expenditure, but Sang-hyun was different. In his previous life, it had taken 50 years to uncover his unique ability. Now, with prior knowledge, he could exploit it far earlier. Artifacts dependent on mana lost their cost entirely when absorbed by him, albeit with some penalties. Placing the Berserker Ring on his finger, he began synchronizing his mana, refining his power further. Private Club, Gangnam District, Seoul. A heavy glass slammed onto the table, disrupting the low murmur of conversation. Frustration radiated from the yellow-haired player as he relayed Sang-hyun's abilities to the man before him, but the response was cold, unimpressed. A calculated silence followed before a single question was posed. What exactly was expected in return? The yellow-haired player hesitated, emphasizing the business potential of Sang-hyun's rapid rise. Yet arrogance was met with immediate punishment. Pain tore through his head as his ear was severed, his scream filling the room. The man remained indifferent, casually pouring alcohol over the wound, relishing the torment. The message was clear. In this world, favors had a price.
The next day, at the Jamil 4-3 training grounds, Sang-hyun sat down to rest, still processing how the Berserker Ring had changed everything. For some reason, the voice I was using was removed from the website. Let's continue with this voice. His stomach rumbled, a lingering effect of its consumption. But he reminded himself that light always followed darkness. Lifting his long sword, he rolled it in his grip, reached for its handle mid-spin, and caught it effortlessly. The weapon felt significantly lighter, a result of the ring's lightweight effect. With the Devour artifact's skill, its mana cost had been erased, but as a penalty, the effect had been halved. Even so, the weight reduction was substantial enough that switching to a greatsword seemed like the best option for now. Opening his status window, he examined his stats. He had reached level 7, possessed 3 titles, had no constellation yet, and his current stats showed 325 health, 32 mana points, and 307 experience points. As he assessed his progress, it became clear that he needed to start drawing the attention of the constellations. Since a player could only form a contract with one, the choice required careful consideration. Ideally, he would want one that complemented his strongest stat, luck. However, without the necessary attributes to pique their interest, there was only one thing to do: train. After 3 days of rigorous training and long-distance driving, he finally arrived. Stepping out of the car and stretching his sore back, exhaustion weighed on him. But there was comfort in knowing that he had acquired a new skill: ambidextrous sword training, level 1. The skill enhanced his adaptability with all swords except daggers and one-handed longswords, a valuable addition to his growing arsenal. Looking ahead, dungeon number 101 stood before him, a solo player exclusive dungeon. Normally, players waited months for a chance to enter one, making it a rare opportunity. It was sheer luck that he had been able to drive out here. Just as he was about to step inside, the sound of a nearby vehicle caught his attention. A dark car pulled up on the road, confirming that someone had followed him through the forest. Their purpose remained unclear, but whatever it was, the matter would be settled inside the dungeon. The moment he entered, his pursuers followed. 4 men from the bar trailed behind their leader, glancing around in confusion upon seeing him seated calmly on a nearby rock, as if waiting for them. There was no reason to believe they had entered the wrong dungeon. This was a solo player instance, meant for only one person at a time. The largest among them sneered, questioning the logic behind his actions. Sang-hyun remained unbothered, gripping his long sword and assessing the group. The absence of a healer and mage indicated that sustainability had been abandoned. Instead, the party consisted solely of swordsmen and an archer, a classic formation of a hyena pack, specializing in hunting other players. The brown-haired man in the group issued a warning, emphasizing the risks involved. Death here meant that even the body would never be found. Sang-hyun smiled knowingly. In his past life, the hyenas had been eradicated by the relentless surveillance of the Players' Association, but at this moment, they still roamed freely. Among them, the archer posed the greatest threat, a factor already taken into account. The archer urged his teammates to act quickly, unaware that this was precisely the scenario Sang-hyun had orchestrated. A perfect setting for eliminating 4 bodies. A solo dungeon ensured that no interruptions would occur. The brute among them moved first, cursing loudly, but their leader raised a hand, opting for a more calculated approach. The brute hesitated but ultimately obeyed, though frustration remained evident. There was no patience for drawn-out fights, and Sang-hyun challenged them all to attack simultaneously. A twisted grin formed on the brute's face as he lunged forward, swinging a massive sword with a threat of permanent silence. Sang-hyun remained motionless, waiting for the attack. Dungeons adhered to the law of survival of the fittest. Monsters constantly sought to claim lives, and within these treacherous spaces, artifacts and rewards awaited those strong enough to take them. There were no laws, no rules, only the brutal reality that the weak perished. It was a truth learned through experience, one that still held firm. The brute's attack descended, but a single slash cut through the tension. Blood splattered across the dungeon floor. The remaining men stood frozen, their expressions contorted in shock. The brute's severed torso collapsed in 2 pieces, his weapon clattering beside him. Sang-hyun shifted his gaze toward the remaining 3, his voice carrying a calm, almost indifferent tone. The remaining men attempted to flee past him, their leader quickly instructing them to maintain distance. The archer was ordered to cover them while they repositioned. Without hesitation, the archer dashed to the side, signaling readiness, though his mind reeled from what had just transpired. The sight of Sang-hyun effortlessly killing Sang-ho, the brute among them, was unfathomable. Despite only recently awakening, Sang-hyun had somehow reached level 100, casually spinning his sword before glancing in their direction. Sang-hyun smirked, his intentions clear. The archer reacted instantly, loosing 2 arrows in quick succession. Sang-hyun, with effortless precision, slashed them apart mid-air, leaving the archer momentarily stunned. Before another reaction could form, the great sword was hurled through the air, piercing the archer's body with deadly accuracy. The 2 remaining men froze, their leader unable to comprehend the situation. The brown-haired man beside him, visibly shaken, questioned the reality of what they were facing. Realization struck their leader. Sang-hyun had discarded his only weapon. Seeing an opportunity, the leader ordered an attack. The brown-haired man charged forward as Sang-hyun rushed to retrieve his embedded sword. Both men struck simultaneously, their swords descending upon him. At the last moment, Sang-hyun dodged, allowing their forceful strikes to slice through the archer's lifeless body instead. The 2 recoiled in horror, eyes widening at the grim mistake. Still hanging upside down from his evasive maneuver, Sang-hyun observed their expressions with amusement. The brown-haired man trembled, disbelief evident in his posture. Sang-hyun, unbothered, simply pulled his sword free. Without warning, the leader seized the brown-haired man by the head. Panic flashed across the man's face as he struggled, questioning his leader's intentions. Juntae, with no hesitation, used him as a human shield, just as Sang-hyun's sword carved an X-shaped slash through the air. The attack landed, cleaving through the brown-haired man's torso, while also severing part of Juntae's fingers in the process. Juntae staggered back, gripping his wounded hand, struggling to regain control of the situation. Sang-hyun observed with cold amusement before raising a question regarding their true nature, whether they were organ dealers. The accusation struck Juntae, momentarily leaving him stunned. Denial flashed in Juntae's eyes as he tried to recover, but ultimately, it didn't matter. Moments later, the surface of the pond rippled as blood spread through the water. On its edge, Sang-hyun calmly cleaned his sword, watching as the crimson stain dispersed. Becoming accustomed to situations like this was a danger he couldn't afford. His gaze shifted to the pile of weapons behind him, eyes scanning the system notifications. 8 artifacts had been obtained from this dungeon. He slipped on his coat as the system displayed his latest progress. His level had increased by 10, and the number of consumed artifacts had reached 11. His health had risen to 400, his mana by 50, and all of his stats had improved significantly. While the earlier fight could have been avoided, the results made it entirely entirely worth it. There was a strange sense of relief knowing that consuming artifacts did not result in weight gain. Based on his current stats, his strength already matched players who had reached level 50. The speed of his growth raised a question that lingered in the back of his mind: just how much time had passed since his regression. The rate of his progress was nothing short of absurd. He reached into his pocket and retrieved a silver artifact, the recovery ring. Its special effect allowed for the instant removal of status abnormalities, consuming 10 mana per use. Activating it again within the next minute would double the mana cost. Once again, the realization struck. The brute who had recklessly charged at him earlier had been carrying something this valuable. If his entire strategy had relied on the stun ability, the situation could have ended in disaster. Without wasting another moment, he initiated synchronization with the recovery ring. Along a narrow pathway, a group of goblins trudged forward, their crude weapons resting on their shoulders. One of them sensed a presence closing in behind them. Turning around, the creature caught sight of a figure, long sword in hand, eyes covered, moving at a slow and deliberate pace. The requirements to obtain the Lucky Day title demanded something absurd: the slaying of 500 monsters with eyes closed. The goblins recoiled, confusion twisting their grotesque faces. The eerie glow radiating from the figure's sword only deepened their unease. A flicker of frustration crossed the figure's mind as the creatures hesitated. Then, a soft growl filled the air. In that moment, realization settled in. Sight was unnecessary. The shift in air, the sharpness of sound, and the flow of motion were all he needed. Focus locked into place. Instinct took over. The goblins hesitated for a moment longer before finally charging. The figure stood perfectly still until the very last second. Then, with a single sweeping motion, his blade carved through multiple enemies at once. Blood painted the ground in dark streaks, but there was no sense of disgust. There was only exhilaration. A subtle shift in the air signaled the flight of an arrow. His hand moved without thought, snatching the arrow mid-flight before snapping it in half. The goblin archer froze in disbelief, unable to process what had just occurred. Mercy had no place here. Instinct drove the figure forward. The remaining goblins roared in fury, but the sword moved faster than their anger. One by one they fell, cut down with ruthless precision. With every enemy that collapsed, satisfaction grew. Minutes passed until only a single goblin remained. The creature had no time to react before the sword pierced through its chest. Blood coated the blade once more as the system registered the accomplishment. His level rose again, and the coveted D-rank Lucky Day title was finally his. The cloth covering his eyes was removed. The system displayed the title's details. Lucky Day, D-rank, grants 20 points of luck. Additionally, each time the same type of monster is defeated, luck increases by 0.1, up to a maximum gain of 10. Laughter broke the silence, spilling from his lips at the absurdity of the reward. From the shadows, another goblin emerged, only to freeze at the horrific scene before it. The bodies of its kin lay in pieces, soaking in their own blood. Another opportunity presented itself. More goblins appeared. By the time the massacre ended, his luck stat had increased by 30 points. His hands trembled slightly, not from exhaustion, but from excitement. Laughter returned, louder and freer than before. A single title had done more for his luck than most platinum-ranked titles ever could. Its potential value easily exceeded 500 million, perhaps even a billion. Then, without warning, space itself twisted and tore apart. A dimensional rift split open before him, its jagged edges crackling with unstable energy. Cold air rushed from the opening, sending a shiver down his spine. The system immediately displayed a new notification. 3 constellations had arrived. The cleaner of a fallen dimension had appeared, offering power that could make others profoundly unlucky. The pilgrim of grand space had taken interest, drawn to the growing enigma surrounding the figure. The goddess of luck extended her hand, her smile radiant yet filled with unspoken secrets. His breath slowed, fingers curled tightly around the hilt of his sword. Whatever came next, it was bound to be even more chaotic